only in day-to-day use, or even at the occasional festival that could never quite fill it. But even in the movies, when they made The Wiz or when they made the second version of King Kong, it still couldn't come to life. It just resisted vitality.
The impact of the Trade Center on the Lower Manhattan environment was really rather devastating. The plaza in front of the World Trade Center was a concrete football field. It was not an appealing place at all. Most of the shopping and activity took place underground, which was at a further remove from the street life of New York. The buildings only succeeded as abstract objects. They did succeed ultimately pretty well as abstract objects, but it is not out of abstract geometric forms that you make a city. You make a city out of street life. And the World Trade Center pushed away the street life of Lower Manhattan in favor of something very different.
For the Port Authority, meanwhile, far more immediate problems loomed. Almost immediately, the basic premise upon which the towers had been built, the desirability of concentrating trade-related businesses under a single roof, was shown to have little basis in reality. Despite vigorous efforts to promote the complex, few tenants signed up.
At the beginning, because there was not nearly enough business to fill it, it was bailed out by its builders. Governor Nelson Rockefeller committed to putting offices of the state of New York into one tower, and the Port Authority moved all of its own offices into the other. So, in fact, it was mostly a big civic boondoggle, in effect, and had only a minimal amount of tenants who were actually part of the original concept.
By the early 1970s, the World Trade Center, whose final price tag had soared past $1 billion, was losing $10 to $15 million a year, with no end in sight. And there was even worse news for the downtown real estate market. Far from revitalizing the fortunes of Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center had flooded the market with millions of square feet of unwanted office space, deepening the district's economic woes still further.
So by somehow bringing all these many millions, 10 million square feet of office space online at the time that there's an economic recession, I'm pulling people out of your building to come into mine, subsidized by the government. Your building then is not worth as much because your building, by the way, does pay taxes. And yet you've got fewer tenants. So that what we have done here in New York City, at least according to the critics, was we built a new building that we don't need. We've reduced the value of the old buildings that we already had, and we're paying taxes and supporting the police and the schools and fire and everything else. So we've, in a sense, compounded our mistake.
I think when the Trade Center was finished in 1973, we were just at the moment when New York was about to begin descending rather than ascending. The fiscal crisis would hit. The buildings would remain largely empty for many years. They would consume the kind of energy on their floors with fluorescent lights that had only one switch and were simply on or off. There was in every way a kind of symbol of empty wastefulness that represented an overreaching ambition, perhaps on the part of Americans, and a blind eye to the environment and to other kinds of social equations that seemed to be lost in this sort of blank symbolism of these two great icons.
On the rainy, windswept morning of April 4th, 1973, while work on the upper floors of the two towers continued, the Port Authority held a dedication ceremony for the complex. A somber event forced by bad weather to move from the outdoor plaza to the lobby of the North Tower. The guest of honor, Secretary of Labor Peter Brennan, never showed up. Nor did New York's Mayor John Lindsay. Nor, to the astonishment of those present, did the man most responsible for the project, Austin Tobin, who had retired from the Port Authority the year before, worn out and disheartened. When a reporter asked him why he had missed the historic ceremony, Tobin replied simply, because it was raining.
He was not there at the official opening of the World Trade Center, He never moved into the World Trade Center. And he really hardly goes down there until he is dying of cancer. So is it sad? Yes, it's extremely sad. It's a very sad and unexpected end to the story, because this guy was one of the most powerful and most efficient and admired and studied bureaucratic leaders in the history of the United States. But his crowning achievement turns out to be, in the end, a big drop of bitterness for him.
You know, we named the plaza the Austin Tobin Plaza long after he left. And Austin, we knew, was very sick. And think of all the projects that the Port Authority did. I think Austin felt that the Trade Center was his greatest. And I got a call one day, and he came down in a wheelchair. And I wheeled him out to the plaza. And he asked if he could be left alone. And Austin sat in that wheelchair for almost 2 hours. And he looked at the plaza and the great sculpture that was in the plaza, and he could see the hotel and the customs house and the commodity building, and the Nagari sculpture is beautiful, and Fritz Koenig's sculpture, which was in the middle of that fountain. You know, those were great works of art. And I remember leaving him there, and then I came and got him. And I never saw him again after that. He died almost within weeks after that one moment, 2 hours, being out there looking at the plaza of the World Trade Center, named after him.
The most sublime and transcendent episode in the entire history of the World Trade Center would come in the first dark and difficult years after its opening, while the city lay deep in the worst financial crisis of its history, and while the towers themselves, still unfinished on the uppermost floors, seemed to stand as a painfully extravagant monument to folly and misguided ambition. For 6 years following his epiphany in the dentist's office in Paris, Philippe Petit had nurtured his dream, painstakingly perfecting his skills as a high-wire artist and devouring everything he could find about the Twin Towers. In early January 1974, he flew to New York City for the first time in his life to put in motion the next elaborate phase of the illegal escapade he now called simply the coup. He was 24 years old.
When I came to New York, it was winter, and I had a little journal or a little whatever. I wrote my thoughts, and I thought, it's old, it's dirty, it's full of skyscrapers, I love it. That was my first little entry, the first day I saw New York. I remember my first encounter with the Twin Towers. I got out of the subway, it was a long subway ride, and out of the darkness, I emerged at the base of one of the towers and look up, and like a slap in the face, I saw that my dream was impossible. I mean, it was right there in aluminum and glass and steel and concrete behind it. It was right there. It said impossible. And yet, somehow, I actually find myself trespassing over the plaza, still under construction, and sneaking in one of the towers and climbing inside the building until I find myself very close to the top, and until there were no more windows, no more partitions. They were just the skeleton, the beautiful steel columns and beams of the building. And then I emerged, and there were no gates, there were nothing to protect you from the devouring void. And I turned and I looked, and the second I looked at the other tower, another time the word impossible etched itself inside me. But somehow I went back down and looked again from the street, and there I realized it's impossible, but I'll do it. And there was the beginning of a second wave of work, the real work, the work of getting into the building, not into archaeological findings or architectural magazines, but this time it was the monster, the beast, getting into the belly of the beast every day, which I did, hiding myself, disguising myself, sneaking, being caught, abandoning the project, going back to it for 8 months. 8 months in New York. And the towers, the more I got to know them, the more they become an ally. That's why when I say I conquered them, probably it's wrong. I married them, certainly. But they became my friends.
It was 1974, and remember now, I had opened the tower at the end of 70, and I wanted public relations. I needed publicity. I had at least 10 million, 12 million square feet of space. And one day, a young journalist, he said he was, named Philippe Petit from France, showed up in my office with 2 photographer friends of his. These were his buddies. And he said, you know, I'd like to do an article on the World Trade Center. And I said, welcome, that's great. And naturally, I never asked, show me your credentials. And later on, I recognized that the subject always got back to how do those towers move in the wind?
After 8 months of false starts, last-minute reversals, heartbreaking postponements, and maddening delays, the hour of the coup finally arrived. At 6 o'clock on the evening of Tuesday, August 6th, 1974, while one team made its way up into the North Tower, Petit, delirious with exhaustion and seething with the holy madness of his dream, slipped up to the top of the South Tower with 2 Confederates posing as delivery men in tow, carrying with them 3 heavy crates filled with equipment, including a disassembled balancing pole, wire for rigging, 250 feet of 1-inch braided steel cable, and a bow and arrow.
The first problem was how to pass the cable across, how to pass the first line, which will ultimately become a rope strong enough to pull the heavy steel cable. So how to get that fishing line across is like 200 feet from center of roof to center of roof, roughly. We had all kind of ideas, and the idea that prevailed was the one I thought was ridiculous, was a bow and arrow. But it actually worked. So with a fishing line and a bow and arrow, we passed the first line across, and then all night we pulled, and then the cable was secured.
It took all night to complete the complex job of rigging, to anchor and secure as best he could the slender 1-inch cable a quarter of a mile in the sky, across the 130-foot gap separating the 2 immense towers. 1,360 feet below, Wall Street was just beginning to come to life, when, at a little past 7, on the morning of August 7th, 1974, Philippe Petit stepped out onto the slender thrumming wire that stretched across the immense shimmering void.
Whenever other worlds invite us, whenever we are balancing on the boundaries of our limited human condition, that's where life starts. That's where you start feeling yourself living. So when I found myself 1 foot on the wire, 1 foot on the building, and ready to decide to shift my way to become a bird, it was not something new. And after a few steps, I knew I was in my element. I didn't even took the full length of the crossing to get to know the rigging and the vibration of the building and the wire. And then very slowly as I walked, I was overwhelmed by a sense of easiness, a sense of simplicity. And actually I can be seen on the first pictures smiling probably out of disbelief. It's so easy after all those years and months of ups and downs and detours, victories and disasters. Finally, I was carrying my life on a path that was the simplest, the most beautiful, and the easiest.
Down on the street below, thousands of people on their way into work looked up in wonder and disbelief, transfixed by the sight of the tiny figure walking on air between the 2 towers.
Somehow I found myself spending 45 minutes and doing 8 crossings. There were thousands of people, at some point 100,000 people. And actually, at some point, during these different crossings, I actually could hear my audience a quarter of a mile below. and I could hear them punctuating what I was doing on the wire. Let's say if I would take a bow on one leg or salute the horizon or kneel in front of the tower to say hello to the tower, I would hear almost with an echo the people cheering, screaming, applauding.
I had in my car a radio that connected me to the police desk at the World Trade Center. And on the day in question, the light went on. And the patrolman at the police desk said, "Mr. T, there's a problem in the World Trade Center." I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "There's a guy walking on a tightrope between the two towers. What should we do?" And I couldn't think of anything else. I said, "Don't let him fall off." And I hung up. So then I drove a little further and I called back. I said, "By the way, this is incredible. There's somebody walk. If he doesn't fall off and he comes on, don't arrest him."
Within minutes, police officers were dispatched to the roof of the South Tower. Sergeant Charles Daniels of the Port Authority Police never forgot the things he saw that day.
Well, after arriving on the rooftop, Officer Myers and I observed the tightrope dancer, because you couldn't call him a walker, approximately halfway between the two towers. And upon seeing us, he started to smile and laugh, and he started going into a dancing routine on the high wire. He then went down to one knee, and we stepped to the background. I said for everyone to be quiet. And at this time, he laid down on the high wire and, just lackadaisically rolled around on the wire like. He got up, he started walking and laughing and dancing, and he turned around and ran back out into the middle. He was bouncing up and down. His feet were actually leaving the wire, and then he would resettle back on the wire again. Unbelievably, really, to the point that everybody was spellbound in the watching of it. And I personally figured I was watching something that somebody else would never see again in the world. Thought it was once in a lifetime.
During the walks, I had a sense of dancing on top of the world. I had a sense of having a communion with the city of New York, represented by the crowd below. I had a sense of having stepped in otherworldly matters. At some point in one of the crossings, I lay down on the wire and looked at the sky, and I saw a bird above me. And again, because of my sense were decuplated, I could see that bird pretty high up, and I saw the eyes were red. And I thought of the myth of Prometheus there. But the bird was circling and looking at me as if I was invading his territory, as if I was trespassing, which I was. So at some point I thought the gods, the god of the wind, the gods of the towers, the god of the wire, all those invisible forces that we persist in thinking they don't exist, but actually that rule our lives, might become impatient, might become annoyed by my persistent vagabondage there. So my intuition told me it was time for me to close the curtain of this very intimate performance. It was a walk between me and the towers, and I landed on the same tower from which I started, the South Tower, and then I had the octopus of the authority, grabbed me by their hundreds of arms.
When he came in off the wire, Petit was immediately taken into custody and rudely manhandled down into an underground police station deep beneath the South Tower, where he was formally charged with no fewer than 14 misdemeanors, including criminal trespass, disregarding police orders, reckless endangerment, and performing without a permit. Then he was besieged by an army of admiring reporters.
Why did you do this? That's the thousand why this morning. There is no why. It's just because when I see a beautiful place to put my why, I cannot resist.
Weren't you afraid up there at all?
I was not afraid, but I was just looking what I have in front of me. I have really something which was huge and incredible, So afraid not, but living more than 1,000%. So perhaps that's close to afraid, I don't know. But at the same time, I was happy.
You need dreams to live. It's as essential as a road to walk on and as bread to eat. I would have felt myself dying if this dream would have been taken away from me by reason. The dream was as big as the towers. There was no way it could be taken away from me by authority, by reason, by destiny. It was really anchored to me in such a way that life was not conceivable without doing this.
The astonishing feat of high-wire poetry was the highest point in Philippe Petit's life, and in many ways, in the life of the Twin Towers themselves. As Guy Tazzoli had predicted, the exploit was front-page news around the country and around the world. And Petit himself became an instant folk hero, and nowhere more so than in New York. In the end, thanks in large part to Tazzoli himself, who personally interceded with the judge, all charges were dropped, and the 24-year-old Frenchman was sentenced instead to perform for a group of children in Central Park.
Philippe Petit was the first person to humanize these things. You know, he put a human mark on them. He said, I don't care about your architect and your plans for world trade. I'm going to walk this thing. And there he did, doing this amazing feat in which the whole city applauded. Because, first of all, it took guts and skill. But also it took these two buildings and he conquered them in some astonishing way that had the whole town cheering. But it was an astonishing moment. And after that, it never happened again. It's as if you did that once. It was not to be repeated.
Fabulous, you know, it's just that this guy had done this and it made the towers belong, if you would, more to New York.
Petit himself would never lose his deep love for the towers. In honor of his achievement, the Port Authority presented him with a free lifetime pass to the observation deck on the South Tower, where, on a bright windswept afternoon, not long after his historic walk, he signed his name in indelible ink on a steel beam overlooking the vast canyon where he had danced among the clouds. In the years to come, he would return to the high perch whenever he could, trying, without success, to relive the amazing walk in his mind, and hoping to catch a glimpse one more time of the valiant seagull he had once seen sailing high above him, a quarter of a mile in the sky. It never came. Though few people realized it at the time, Petit's extraordinary exploit marked a crucial turning point in the life of the Twin Towers, and in the life of the beleaguered city that was their home. In the decades to come, the fortunes of both would undergo a remarkable transformation, as the foundering city, all but written off in the darkest hours of the fiscal crisis, began to rise in new and unexpected ways. And as the World Trade Center itself, a hollow mockery when it opened in 1971, finally began to fulfill the grandiose promise of its name.
Well, in many ways, the World Trade Center didn't look to most Americans like something that had anything to do with world trade. It was a little bit like the World Series, not really having much to do with the rest of the world. It might have been more convincing if it had been called something like the Manhattan Business Center. For the rest of the world, though, it came to be the quintessential expression of globalization, in the sense that New York was the capital of the world economy. And in that sense, the two tallest towers in New York were really bound to symbolize economic globalization, even if people living in Manhattan just thought they were the biggest shadow-casting pieces of real estate downtown.
The first changes came while the city still toiled in the depths of the fiscal crisis. In 1975, the observation deck atop the South Tower was open to the public for the first time. And almost overnight, became one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city. 1 year later, on July 4th, 1976, the nation's bicentennial celebration came to a stunning climax in New York Harbor, where thousands of small boats and dozens of tall ships could be seen parading majestically against the breathtaking backdrop of the soaring Twin Towers. That same year, a spectacular rooftop restaurant opened for business on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower. Suddenly I knew, the food critic Gail Green wrote, that New York would survive. If money and power and ego could create this extraordinary pleasure and instant landmark, money and power and ego could rescue the city from its ashes.
The observation deck and windows on the world were the two things, in my judgment, that turned the city of New York from looking at the Trade Center as some monster downtown to something that was theirs. They began to adopt it, and it was great. It was so successful that you had to wait 7 months to get a Saturday night reservation there unless you knew somebody. It was incredible. And we were consistently the highest grossing restaurant in the whole world.
These kinds of things give a building a human dimension. One would hope that the building would have a human dimension in its design. That has always been debatable. It's the case of the Trade Center. But events did happen that showed that this could be brought into the city and into the life of the city. Another thing about the Trade Center that changed it was the whole changing character of Lower Manhattan. People began to live downtown, and they rather liked the Trade Center, the big open space. And then the people living in Tribeca, also the people living in Battery Park City, began to see these buildings as an identifiable landmark in their neighborhoods, in their daily lives. You know, you could orient yourself. You knew where you were in relationship to the Trade Center towers.
Now, as the years went on and we reached the period of the 90s with the great boom in financial services businesses needed much more space, and they gradually took over space as the state moved away to other locations, as Port Authority moved some of its functions out and so forth. That stuff was rented commercially.
The Trade Center took nearly a generation to become truly successful. Through the 1980s, the buildings filled up. In the 1990s, they became truly profitable and gained a kind of credibility in the commercial real estate market that had been predicted at the very beginning but not realized for over 20 years.
And it turned out fine. The Trade Center was self-supporting. In fact, when I retired from the Port Authority of New York in 1987, the World Trade Center in New York was making more than $133 million a year, net. So, you know, it worked. And then all those buildings in Lower Manhattan, all the jobs that it created for people.
Even though we thought of them as a failure, I think now, looking back, we can see what they did contribute. First of all, economically, had they not been there in the late 1990s when New York City suddenly boomed practically like no place on the planet, the city needed all 10, 15 million square feet of office space that those buildings provided. If they were not there, so many other companies would have had to go elsewhere. So we had that space. So in a sense, they helped make possible the renaissance of New York in the 1990s.
Now, the reality was that these huge office blocks built for commercial purposes were becoming more and more centers for world trade and world transactions generally. So in a way, the World Trade Center became more and more truly a World Trade Center over time, and by the 1990s, perhaps for the first time, really was worthy of that name. And I'm not sure how far Americans, particularly New Yorkers, quite saw that it was a symbol of economic globalization.
By the 1990s, the New World Order set in motion a half-century before had succeeded in ways no one could have imagined in the years following the end of World War II, or even as the towers themselves had first begun to rise at the very height of the Cold War. In less than 2 decades, the cultural and commercial energies unleashed by the forces of globalization had breached political and ideological barriers around the world, defeating and absorbing many of America's one-time enemies behind the Iron Curtain, linking the economic fortunes of distant nations as never before, setting whole populations and cultures on the move, and sending millions of new immigrants from every corner of the globe flooding into New York City, in numbers that rivaled and with a diversity that far exceeded even that of the great immigration of a century before. No building in New York, or for that matter in the world, symbolized those astonishing transformations more dramatically than the World Trade Center itself, which by the late 1990s had become a microcosm of the new global culture, humming with electronic financial transactions 24 hours a day, and home to a bewilderingly diverse working population that included Sikh computer programmers, Israeli accountants, Turkish engineers, and financial experts from emerging markets in Malaysia, Syria, Uruguay, and Ghana. Numbered among the tall tower's window washers were men who hailed from Poland, Yugoslavia, Albania, Turkey, and Ireland. The 79 employees at Windows on the World included immigrants from 30 different countries.
Well, the United States is the economy that seems to inhale more than it exhales. It inhales capital, it inhales people. The huge increase in flows of capital and people into the United States, which characterized the 1980s and 1990s, undoubtedly created a kind of asymmetry. And so although economically the United States was completely integrated into the world economy, politically it was becoming more and more detached from it. The myths which go right back to the very foundation of the United States about this special providence that exempts the US from the rest of the world's nasty political conflicts. I mean, this proves incredibly tenacious. People are still clinging to this in the 1990s, when it's absolutely clear that the US had never been more connected to the rest of the world.
The first hint for most New Yorkers, and for that matter for most Americans, that globalization might bring with it unforeseen consequences, came a few minutes after 12 on a cold and cloud-covered Friday afternoon in the winter of 1993.
We mustn't forget that the building had already earned its footnote in history as an object of scorn, as a symbol of everything most of us in the United States think is what is great about our country. Our open, free exchange of capitalism and ideas, and our willingness to deal with the world as an overall community.
That failed miserably and killed 6 people, which is about as minimal a number as you could think of at the World Trade Center. But we didn't take that threat seriously enough, I think. We took it seriously, but not seriously enough.
By the summer of 2001, the culture of air-mindedness New York had been pioneering for nearly a century had reached its very zenith. Immense towers now soared high into the air in cities around the world. Jet planes moved people and goods at high speed across the skies, while global broadcast networks and new digital media sped images and information around the world instantaneously. Thanks in large part to the astonishing projective power of American commercial culture, which had now penetrated to every corner of every nation in the world, the Twin Towers had become the most familiar structures on the most familiar skyline in the world, and the ultimate emblem of the forces of globalization still making their restless way around the globe. New York itself, meanwhile, having reaffirmed its status as the city at the center of the world, had emerged as one of the most strangely paradoxical cities on Earth. At once bewilderingly diverse and cosmopolitan, and yet, as its own citizens often freely acknowledged, strikingly insular and inward-looking.
I don't think cosmopolitanism is something that we define only in terms of connections and awareness. We like to. In its better guise, it is about awareness and sophistication and connection and knowing what the world is. But cosmopolitanism can sometimes also mean a degree of self-absorption that blinds you to things outside. And maybe we've just been spending too much time, staring at ourselves and thinking that the world begins at the Hudson River and ends at the East River and there isn't anything else. Cosmopolitan people are often people who have substantial powers of denial. Maybe we just didn't want to see what we didn't want to see.
Well, I think one of the sad things to me is to remember the enormous human effort that went into building those buildings. The gigantic endeavor, the thousands of construction workers, the millions and millions of man-hours and effort, and how quickly it could all be torn down. The fact that just this physical creation, could be destroyed, that took years and years and years to do, to conceive, to plan, to execute. I guess, again, it's like us, it takes us a lifetime to create the person we are and can be wiped out on a single mistake or accident. And so it is with cities and buildings.
I think it's precisely like death. I mean, death of someone you know or someone you love. I don't know how many people love those buildings, but certainly a lot of people knew them. And then they were gone. I mean, how can it be that something that extreme can happen so quickly and so irreversibly? Can't we just kind of reel that backward a little bit? No, we can't. We can't do it anymore with those buildings and with death. And I think the emotional reaction is very similar. This was public death.
On a perfect, almost achingly beautiful late summer morning in early September 2001, a day of seemingly infinite visibility, one man later said, characterized by the rare and exquisite flying conditions airline pilots call severe clear. Life in New York and much of the rest of the contemporary world was changed irrevocably in the space of less than 2 hours.
In my years in New York, there's obviously nothing like it. Nothing comes close. As a newspaper man, I've seen other horrors, wars, and the earthquake in Mexico in '85, which killed 20,000 people. But that was an act of nature, not of man. The combination of the death, the spectacular event of the 2 skyscrapers collapsing, and the motivations behind it, all those things, I think, made this something that just struck a knife right into the heart of every New Yorker, knowing that we'd never be able to look at our city the same way again.
First of all, it's a surprise on a beautiful day at the center of this powerful nation, which has not been attacked on its own shores or its own land by a foreign power in almost 200 years. So that's a new thing. Secondly, the public focus on this. Never in the history of the world had there been anything even close. There's not really a second place. The second place would probably be the assassination of President Kennedy. A world event where the world is focused on that story, but nothing like this, where it's seen instantaneously as it happens by tens of millions of people around the globe.
In a little less than 2 hours, with an almost poetically horrifying symmetry, the symbols and instruments of the city's uniquely air-minded culture and of globalization itself, skyscrapers, jets, and the mass media, would be turned back against themselves with a devastatingly lethal impact and effect.
We were utterly struck by the fact that nothing here fit with any prior experience. I mean, of course, people were talking about how it looked like something in a disaster movie. We could only think in terms of life imitating art because we had no other thing to compare it to. So people went to the movies and compared it.
Around 8:45 a.m. on the morning of September 11th, 2001, people along the west side of Manhattan heard the piercing whine of a jet plane moving south down the Hudson. Everything about its trajectory was wrong. Heading south along an airway normally reserved for northbound traffic, it was moving much too fast and much too close to the ground, nearly 500 miles per hour at an altitude of just 900 feet, more than twice the speed permitted for aircraft that low. It took less than 90 seconds for American Airlines Flight 11 to hurtle the entire length of Manhattan Island. A little after 8:46 a.m., the huge 137-ton Boeing 767 measuring more than half a football field in length from wingtip to wingtip, and carrying more than 9,000 gallons of highly inflammable jet fuel, flashed across the final 20 blocks from Canal Street to the World Trade Center, and tore through the north wall of the North Tower between the 94th and 98th floors. Instantly killing everyone on board and wreaking incomprehensible carnage across 5 full floors of the building. Witnesses on the upper floors of the South Tower were stunned to see a wall of flame burst through the south windows of Tower 1, 130 feet away, followed by a shower of disintegrating desks, files, furniture, computer terminals, airplane parts, and burning bodies.
If you were just below where the plane hit, your ceilings fell, you saw the glint of the plane going overhead, there's an overwhelming feeling of terror, and you were probably knocked off your feet. And of course, if you were in the zone itself, you may have died instantly, but even very close, and this is very tragic, very close to the regions of impact, there were people who lived for long minutes as they sought refuge from, the building flames, the tremendous heat. A couple of them even were able to phone. And then often in that region, their lives ended quickly in the fire, or they chose to leap from the tower.
That airplane straddled several floors, and it delivered a hell of a punch. The building swayed. We know that when that punch was delivered, the swaying took the form of waves that ran vertically up and down the building multiple times, sort of echoing up and down the building. And really the incredible thing is, considering the speed with which those airplanes were flying, enormous weight, enormous speed. Rather than decapitating the buildings or pushing them over, the buildings absorbed the impact entirely. They took the hit and they stood.
I was heading for the Holland Tunnel, which has a 4-block concourse, if you want to call it, leading to the toll booth. And as I turned into the first of those 4 blocks and I looked up, I said, oh my God, there was a hole in tower number 1. And my first thought was, it can't be a helicopter, the hole's too big. And the second was, my God, it can't be a commercial plane because they're instructed to fly into the river if they have problems. I knew that.
By 8:55, an army of firemen, police officers, emergency medical personnel, and government officials, including the mayor himself, had begun to descend on Lower Manhattan, along with an army of reporters, photographers, and television crews, as the machinery of the largest media apparatus in the world began to focus on the 16-acre site. At 9:02 a.m., little more than 15 minutes after the attack, millions of people in the metropolitan region, and tens of millions more across the country and around the world, were staring intently at the smoldering skyline of Lower Manhattan, when a dark shape appeared on the horizon above the New Jersey lowlands and came hurtling across the upper bay.
I got out of my car. Other people did. And suddenly I saw plane number 2 coming from the south over the Statue of Liberty, going very fast. They say between 500 and 600 miles an hour. And I saw it smash into the south wall of number 2 in an oblique angle. I saw this big ball of flame, and the nose came out on the north side and the east side. And my first reaction, my God, there's poor people above, because they're going to wipe out all the staircases and all the sprinkler systems. That airplane just went sliced right through it. And the power of such a big plane at that speed. And for a moment, incredible sadness for the people there, and then an incredible anger, feeling that somebody had deliberately rammed into those towers and those poor innocent people that were in there.
I was at the Tweed Courthouse on Chambers Street, right behind City Hall. I grabbed a notebook and ran to the street in time to see the second one hit. I knew right away, obviously, it was terrorism. This amazing fireball that came roaring towards Broadway. And people on the street corner just going, oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, That expression must have been uttered like 10 million times that day. Just astonishment at what they were looking at.
We know that when the airplanes hit, there was an instantaneous release of energy in the form of fuel vaporized that caught on fire. There was fire instantaneously across multiple floors. That fire, which was a kerosene fire, jet fuel fire, burned very hot, but it also burned very fast. We're talking 3 to 5 minutes. But what it did is it ignited a simultaneous office fire, in both cases, across multiple floors. An office fire the like of which had not been imagined before. In all cases, an office fire is many things burning, partitions, carpets in particular, computer cases, but paper, mostly paper. And if you look at the dynamics of the collapse, what you find is that in both cases, it was the paper fire that was sustained long enough because of the amount of paper in there to cause the steel to weaken, to cause the collapse and the hammering down in both cases. I mean, paper on that day was a constant presence. It rained down on the city as if in mockery of the kind of business that was done at the Trade Center. Here, have some of the paper. And it burned, and it brought the buildings down.
The second plane had struck the South Tower at 9:02:54 a.m., just 16 minutes after the first plane went in. By then, the first teams of firemen and rescue workers had already arrived at the foot of the North Tower, where they were greeted by a scene of horror and devastation that defied the imagination. On the Austin Tobin Plaza, there were corpses everywhere. The mangled bodies of men and women who had already jumped or fallen from the upper floors of the building, and the charred remains of passengers from Flight 11, some still belted into their seats. Far above, meanwhile, in the upper reaches of the towers themselves, the gaping black holes where the planes had gone in marked a stark dividing line between life and death.
In the North Tower, the plane struck at the center, and it also struck much higher up. And because it struck at the center, the fuel immediately went down the shafts and created a much broader fire. The flames were much more intense. The number of floors that were available to move up and down were many fewer. So what happened was people were breaking windows in the North Tower, desperate to get air, and there was no place to go because there were no stairwells that were open up and down. People were stacked 4 or 5 on top of each other at the broken windows, desperate to breathe. And other people were hanging on to each other across the steel columns from window to window, hanging out of the windows, desperate to breathe, and just, grasping each other to keep hold of the building.
One of the most horrific scenes in the history of the nation took place 1,000 feet above Lower Manhattan. And it took the lives of people who were staring down at safety, at the most populous city in the nation, civilization at its peak. But they didn't have anywhere to get there. And there's really few words to describe how terrible that must have been.
By 9:30, ordinary life had all but ceased across the city, as millions of New Yorkers and hundreds of millions more around the world looked on in shock and disbelief at the nightmarish images unfolding in real time on TV.
You usually can gauge things, within a few minutes, so that they may start getting worse. But at one time you say, well, this is what they are. But this was something that started getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
At 9:38, word came that terrorists had commandeered a third jetliner and crashed it into the Pentagon, killing everyone on board and 126 people on the ground. And not long after, that a fourth plane had crashed into a hillside in rural Pennsylvania, brought down by some of its own heroic passengers before it could reach its intended target in the nation's capital.
What struck me at the time, I think, is the most significant part of that was when they came on and said that the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all air traffic in the United States to be grounded. I knew that had never happened before. You know, there are tens of thousands of planes in the United States at any one time, and to say they have to land now. What hit me was that this is really beyond whatever I had thought.
And then, on a morning of hideous surprises, already without precedent in the city's history, something happened that no one had ever thought possible before. Something beyond comprehension. Something that had never happened in the history of tall buildings since the first skyscrapers had gone up at the foot of Manhattan over a century before. High up in both towers, the raging fires were now generating 3 to 5 times the heat of a nuclear power plant, and the interior temperature had soared in places to nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At 9:58 a.m., having withstood the ferocious heat of the inferno within for nearly an hour, the floor trusses on the 80th floor of the South Tower began to give way. Columns along the east wall began to buckle upwards, and the entire building began to come down. As the quarter-mile-tall structure dissolved into a massive shroud of smoke and dust, thousands of people in the surrounding streets began to cry out in horror and disbelief, then ran for their lives, pursued by an enormous billowing cloud of dust and debris.
It never occurred to me that these two buildings would come down. So that when they did, it was the most shocking moment, maybe that I'd ever had. That the South Tower began to tip forward and then righted itself and came down in what, in memory, seems like a slow motion moment. What happened in 10 seconds. 10 seconds. It's a knockout in boxing. The whole thing came down. It was just, to me, still, it's a staggering moment in New York, in any history, in world history, for a place that had never had anything like that happen to it ever before. The Empire State Building didn't come down. You couldn't. 93, the 4,000-pound bomb goes off in the basement, doesn't come down. This time it came down. This time they figured it out. And I thought, oh man, something new's happened here.
At 10:28 a.m., 30 minutes after the South Tower fell, the television antenna atop the North Tower began to give way, followed a fraction of a second later by the upper floors of the building itself, as the entire North Tower now came down too.
Then there was a release of heat that was off the scale. Fires ignited. Crushing and tearing was going on, and chaos, mostly just chaos, on some mathematical level was happening. You can't even describe it physically because it was too big, too chaotic. It was a cataclysmic release, and it released back into the city in 10 seconds in each case. The surprising thing to me has always been how concentrated it was. They came straight down as if they were aimed directly at their foundations. And of course, anything that was directly underneath no longer existed afterward. The so-called bathtub that ran 6 floors underground below street absorbed the brunt of the energy. Inside that bathtub, during those twin 10-second pulses, what was really happening, nobody can even imagine. We know what the results were. The results were, we were grappling with the results inside that hole for the following 9 months. Where in a sense, probably we'll be grappling with the results for years to come.
I was upstate New York when I heard of the towers being destroyed. A side of me was not believing it. It was a very strange blend of feelings. One was the sorrow, the horror at witnessing human life being obliterated for no reason like that. And I felt something beyond words. I felt almost an alive part of me being squeezed to nothing, being extracted, an evisceration almost. It's an interesting question when you saw those 2 giant towers collapse almost cleanly on themselves. Where did they go? I have read in some architecture article that they were made mostly of air. If you consider the space between the solid molecules, the steel, the concrete, the glass, the aluminum, there was a lot of air, it was mostly air actually. And they disappeared, and it's where did they go was part of the disbelief that I was feeling, because how you can make 200,000 tons of steel disappear. It's unbelievable.
In the end, the 500,000 tons of concrete, steel, glass, and aluminum in each tower had hurtled to the ground in a virtual freefall, traveling at a speed of 125 miles an hour. Shock waves from the twin impacts were picked up more than 40 miles away by seismic instruments used for monitoring earthquakes. The immense columns of rubble and dust drifting away from ground zero could be clearly seen from outer space.
I have to tell you, I didn't know whether the buildings were empty or whether there were tens of thousands of people in them. I just had no idea, and I was totally devastated by the fact that all those people were in there, and this building that I had designed was perhaps falling on them. The buildings were not so important to me. I'm good at buildings, but people are another matter. It was a terrible event. Absolutely terrible.
I don't think you can measure the impact. It's absolutely enormous. Everybody felt it, but of course those who felt it most and will never get over the effects are those who lost people. And the sheer numbers are so appalling, and the horror of the attack is so appalling that, in one sense, New York will never be the same.
With the collapse of the second tower, an eerie quiet descended on New York. By 11 o'clock, hundreds of thousands of dazed and disheveled office workers, many covered in ashes and dust, could be seen marching north from the financial district, straggling uptown along the West Side Highway, or heading over the bridges to Brooklyn. Down at the site itself, hundreds of firemen and rescue workers groped their way across a surreal landscape of smoke and flames at the edge of an immense 7-story pile of tangled steel and debris, searching desperately for any signs of life. All day, doctors and nurses in emergency rooms around the city braced for the anticipated onslaught of injured survivors that never came. Those who got out, one nurse later said. Those who didn't, died.
The story of all the firefighters is dramatic. What struck me about Rescue 2 in Brooklyn is that even though a little firehouse set out kind of in the middle of the Brooklyn borough, they were at the World Trade Center when the second plane hit. And since that's only about 16 minutes, They had to take, you know, a minute, let's take a minute or two for the alarm to go out. It's got to take you another minute or something to get your shoes on and to get on the truck. And then to go through Brooklyn at rush hour in the morning and go through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel and be at the World Trade Center in 12 minutes. By the way, where they all died. Is an incredible story.
Around 5:20 in the afternoon, building number 7, a 47-story tower on the north side of Vesey Street, succumbed to a raging oil fire within and fell to the ground.
One of the surprising things, you could call it almost a sad poetic justice, is that the only buildings that were completely destroyed by this collapse were the buildings that carried the Trade Center label, buildings 1 through 7. No other buildings, with the exception of the small Orthodox church there that dissolved, were destroyed. And every building that carried the label died.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy.
No doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated.
New York City has pulled up the drawbridge. Every crossing to Manhattan Island is closed. The financial heart of the world's only superpower evacuated.
Night fell, and an end finally came to the most harrowing day in the city's history. Across the city, friends and family members of those thought to have been in the towers continued to roam the streets or make the rounds of hospital emergency rooms, anxiously looking for loved ones who would not come home. When asked on television about the future of his city, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani replied without hesitation. "We're going to rebuild," he said. "We're going to come out of this emotionally stronger, politically stronger, much closer together as a city. And we're going to come out of this economically stronger too. The people of New York City will be whole again."
The day itself was a horror. And yet that day itself, when, the president couldn't be found, there was the mayor down at the site helping solve the way to think about it. When he was asked about how many casualties there would be, and he said, "More than any of us can bear," that was the most important sentence by a public figure, because it puts sorrow into the story, not just empty rage, not just let's go kill somebody back, which a lot of people felt, including me. But he created a note there that said, wait a minute, we have to think about this as humans and what it did to human beings.
Initial estimates of the number of dead ranged as high as 20,000. In the weeks and months to come, the number would steadily dwindle until the final confirmed toll of those who died in the attack on the World Trade Center stood at 2,792 men, women, and children, including the 156 passengers and crew on board the 2 doomed aircraft. In the end, it had been the second deadliest day in American history, surpassing the casualties of Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and all the battles of the Civil War, except Antietam. Included in the overall total was one particularly staggering figure. 343 members of the New York Fire Department had lost their lives that day, including much of the department's top leadership. No fire department in history had ever suffered anything remotely like it.
We lost all those firemen. We lost police. We had this fantastic contradiction of people who hated you so much that they were willing to give up their life to take yours. and people who loved humanity so much that they were willing to run into the Don building in the smoke and flame and just to save the life of somebody they never met. And that's ineffably beautiful. There's no better definition of love. There's no more inspirational, no more inspiring, no more near to saintly conduct that you can think of than what they demonstrated.
But I'll never forget where I was, and I'll never forget that day. And I remember taking a bus home at night at about 11:30 at Amsterdam on 116th Street, and how quiet the street was. There was an eerie silence like nothing I'd seen in more than 30 years of working there. And I remember a huge truck coming south on Amsterdam with a yellow flashing light. And as it moved past, you could see it was a giant truck carrying earth-moving equipment, obviously heading for the World Trade Center site. And then I remember when the bus came that there was a sign around the little box there that said, "No fare today." And I remember sitting on the bus, and sitting opposite a young woman who was just crying. And I remember when I got off the bus at 83rd Street, she was still crying. I remember just putting my hand on her shoulder. And I said nothing, and she said nothing, and I got off. But I'll always remember that woman.
I went back that night in the middle of this ghastly scene where you could still see the fires burning at the end of the street. Everything was dark with these huge buildings, all black, silhouetted against black. And as the first lights begin to get hooked up, and they're sort of crude halogen lamps, in come a lot of these cars from different places. And the first time you began to see the iron workers, the hard hats, showing up with their tools, with their hats, and saying, "We cut steel, you're gonna need us." And I knew that night that we're gonna be all right. This was like some moment in the Blitz where citizens came out and began to dig the rubble. And these guys knew what to do. They were professionals. Some of them, I'm sure, that showed up in the next couple of days had helped put the towers up. And they had lived long enough now to see them come down. They knew how they were put together, and they were going to help deconstruct the rubble.
On the morning of Wednesday, September 12th, 2001, New Yorkers woke to what was perhaps the bleakest dawn in the city's long history. Overnight, the reality of what had happened had begun to sink in, and hope that many could have survived the twin collapses had all but vanished. The numbers were simply unimaginable, and as the mayor had said, more than anyone could bear. One financial firm in the North Tower, Cantor Fitzgerald, had lost nearly 700 people. The Port Authority, which had built the vast complex, and whose offices had occupied 18 floors in Tower 1, had lost 84 people, including its own director.
We know that many Port Authority people were killed. We know that the entire headquarters was wiped out. This was, for the people within the Port Authority, a blow of unbelievable dimensions psychologically.
It was overwhelming. I mean, it was really overwhelming. No one, we build libraries. I build, $40 million sewer, water main, road projects. This is way beyond anything I had ever come in contact with, anything that I had ever experienced at all. It was very, very disturbing and just extraordinarily sad.
Though the exact number would not be known for months, nearly 3,000 people lay buried within an apocalyptic wasteland of tangled steel and concrete, rising in places to jagged peaks more than 8 stories high and smoldering with subterranean fires. And yet, from that sorrowful, daunting landscape, something extraordinary would begin to emerge from the very start. Something that spoke of the very best that the city and country were capable of and stood for.
That we were able then, in the following 8 months, to clear more than 1 million tons of steel and rubble and human bodies and remains and all that, and do that in 8 months without losing a single person, was to me this amazing human triumph. That we're able to say, we had this terrible day in our history, and we're going to distinguish ourselves by the way we solve it. And I think the city has never been better than it was in the way it went about the after part. I mean, it was a gigantic improvisation. There was no script. And they found the script. You know, they knew how to do it. Everything in their lives in some way must have led to that 16 acres in Lower Manhattan, where they proved the value of what they do for a living, but also the sheer intelligence that's behind it. And this is a place that demanded intelligence and got it. And got it in a way that, that we'll be proud of for generations.
Over the next 9 months, the unbuilding of the World Trade Center, a feat of improvised urban renewal unlike anything the city had ever seen, would rival and in some ways surpass the extraordinary collective achievement that had raised it into the sky. Week after week, month after month, the vast chaos of the pile slowly receded as an army of iron workers, crane operators, demolition experts, and engineers grimly soldiered on, working around the clock in shifts of 8 to 12 hours, a Herculean effort made incalculably more difficult by the fact that the worksite was also a burial ground.
I mean, it was a horrible place to work. It was a horrible place to work. We were putting milled asphalt, you know, to kind of build a road and flatten certain areas, put dirt over the debris so we could bring trucks in and whatnot. And to have a firefighter come up and say, you know, look, I'm sure my son is in this pile of debris here. Could you just give me a couple of hours and I'll search through this? And then out of the corner of your eye to see this guy standing on the pile with a spade. I mean, he had a typical gardening spade and was searching for his son by getting spadefuls of debris and lifting it to his nose to smell, to see if he could smell, you know, putrefying flesh. Put a human face on a tragedy that's very haunting.
On the Memorial Day a year later, Mayor Bloomberg asked a number of people to read some of the names of those who had been killed at the World Trade Center. And while we were waiting to go out, I talked with one of these people who was going to read, and he told me this story.
Richard Anthony Aceto.
He said, I was in Wisconsin when the attack occurred, and as it was happening, I knew, said he, my daughter was at that very moment in a job interview with her employer in the trade tower, and I went crazy, you know, in pain and so forth. As he's telling me this story, I'm reliving it now. I began to cry. He said, we tried to get a plane commercial, we couldn't. We tried to get a private plane, we couldn't. And finally, we got into New York. And we went down to the site. We were taken over by a cop who will never be forgotten by us. He's now a member of our family. And he took us everywhere. We went to 38 places looking for our daughter. And we knew she was dead. At that moment, Senator Hillary Clinton saw me and she motioned me to come over. And she said, "You look terrible, what's wrong?" I said, "I'm sitting with the father of a young woman who was killed." And I began to cry again. But it's like a personal, tremendous loss. And what the father said was he was so proud of New York and appreciative. He said, "I can't tell you how I appreciate what the mayor did." I told him, "I can't just sit here. I have to work. I have to do something." And he said, "Sure, you must work." And he embraced me. He said, "I'll never forget him." Well, I'll never forget him either. And the pain that he went through, and just incredible. And the strength that he displayed.
Teilhard de Chardin, a great French Jesuit paleontologist and a philosopher, said that one of the tricks in life is to convert everything into good. He makes the reference to the stone. You're a sculptor and you have a stone and the stone has a scar in it. And well, all right, so now you have to sculpt around that scar, and you've got to use that scar to make it part of whatever it is you're going to produce that's beautiful. And work with what you have, play it as it lies, you know. So whatever the circumstance, you know, use it for a good purpose. 9/11, how can you possibly use it for good purpose? You think about it. You think, as we've suggested before, you think about, look, what this reminds you of is the importance of your own life and making the most of it, because you can lose it in a flash. And if that's all you learned from 9/11, if that's all you remembered, that, my God, you could extinguish life so suddenly, so unexpectedly, and it could happen to me, and therefore I should think harder about the way I spend my life instead of just wasting it. Now, it's not going to teach you what to do with your life, but it will teach you to do with your life, and to do it more and quicker and better. And that can be extremely valuable. It's had that effect on me.
We are never going to be exactly the same again, those of us who lived through this. We can't be. In the same way that if you lived through the Kennedy assassination or other, cataclysmic events that had just a powerful, wrenching emotional effect on people, you are not quite the same. But everything isn't really different either. There is a glorious, comforting power to normalcy that ultimately pushes its way back in. It's kind of like you can do anything you want in the sand on the beach, but ultimately the tides will sort of work their effect on it and smooth it over. And sometimes we almost don't want to let it do its work because we fear that in some way maybe that's disrespectful of those who died or those who suffered so much, to let normalcy come back. But ultimately it's the law of nature, in fact, that normalcy return. I think it's also true that there is a fundamental kind of New Yorkness that cannot be destroyed by even as cataclysmic an event as this. And our day-to-day business ultimately came back. The business of living, the feeling of living, what city life is like. And that was not destroyed by 9/11. It's in fact the New York equivalent of the tides. It's just there, and ultimately it sort of works its magic of normalcy again. But we will never be exactly as we were. And that's right. It would be wrong to deny the enormity of what's happened. But that doesn't mean everything changes as a result.
I really like them, you know, I really like them. I miss them, I see them right now. None of the other buildings had the power and presence of those towers.
When you ask someone what they'd like to see there, I know that the answer to that question is something you and I have not thought of, something that has far more dimension, far more connection with the city, far more beauty and utility, far more originality than we're capable of dreaming of.
But should one build tall? Yes, I think so. Otherwise, the forces of darkness will have won. I mean, they were attacking our ability to challenge the sky ever since the biblical times. To build tall has been both the arrogance of man and the confidence of man. So we must build again.
Not 110 floors, but not 109 either, maybe 111 or whatever. And I don't care whether it's the tallest building in the world or not. I don't think that's the issue. But I would like to see there a symbol of the city of New York that is as strong or stronger than the symbol that was there before.
I would like to see some depiction of all the religions. List them all. Atheism, ethical humanism, Catholicism, etc., all of them. And you'll notice that each of those religions, these value systems, have two principles they share in common. And the two principles started with monotheism and the Jews. Tzedakah and Tikkun Olam. Tzedakah means generally we must treat one another as brother and sister. We should show one another respect and dignity because we are like things. We are human beings in a world that has nothing else like us. And we are to treat one another with love, charity, use your own words. And the second principle is, well, what do you do with this relationship? Well, we don't know exactly how we got here, why we got here, et cetera, et cetera. That's for minds larger than ours. But we know that we are like kinds, and we should work together to make this as good an experience as possible. Tikkun Olam, let us repair the universe. Now, Islam believes that. Buddhism, that has no God, believes it. Every ethical humanist I ever met believes it. Those two principles, we're supposed to love one another, and we're supposed to work together to make the experience better. That's all the religion you need, really, to make a success of this planet. And I'd like to see that in 9/11 somewhere. I'd like to see that captured somehow.
There's more about New York at American Experience Online. See a map of Lower Manhattan through time, access bonus interviews, and World Trade Center questions and answers with a panel of experts. All this and more at PBS Online, pbs.org. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
How do you get a weed-free lawn, a healthy garden, a home that's pest-free? Every day we work to find new and better solutions. Ortho, proud to support the American Experience on PBS.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
And by funding for this program provided by Rosalind P. Walter, and by the following. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
And by funding for this program provided by Rosalind P. Walter, and by the following. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.